Throughout human history, prophecy has fascinated believers and skeptics alike. The idea that someone could predict specific events centuries or even millennia before they occur challenges our understanding of time, causality, and the nature of reality itself. While many dismiss biblical prophecies as vague predictions that could apply to anything, there are certain prophecies that have left even the most hardened skeptics scratching their heads. These aren't generic predictions about wars or famines that occur in every generation. These are specific, detailed prophecies that named names, predicted precise sequences of events, and came true against astronomical odds. The prophecy we're examining today involves the ancient city of Tyre, a once mighty Phoenician metropolis that dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. What makes this prophecy extraordinary isn't just that it predicted the city's downfall. Dozens of great cities have fallen throughout history, so predicting that a city would eventually be conquered isn't particularly impressive. What's remarkable is the specific sequential details of how Tyre would be destroyed, who would destroy it, what would happen to the ruins, and the final state the city would be left in. The prophet Ezekiel laid out a multi-stage destruction scenario around 586 BC that seemed impossible at the time, yet history records that every single detail came to pass exactly as described. To understand why this prophecy is so significant, you need to understand what Tyre was in the ancient world. Imagine trying to predict the complete destruction of New York City today. Not just its conquest, but its utter obliteration to the point where the island of Manhattan would be scraped clean and turned into a place where fishermen dry their nets. That's essentially what Ezekiel prophesied about Tyre. At the time he made this prophecy, Tyre was at the height of its power. It was essentially the economic superpower of the Mediterranean world, controlling trade routes and establishing colonies across the known world, including the famous city of Carthage in North Africa. Tyre wasn't just powerful economically, it was also considered virtually unconquerable due to its unique geography. The city was actually divided into two parts, a mainland city and an island fortress located about half a mile offshore. The island portion of Tyre had walls that rose 150 feet high from the sea, making it one of the most fortified locations in the ancient world. The city had withstood sieges from the Assyrians and other regional powers. It had its own fresh water supply from springs, productive agriculture, and complete control of the sea. Military strategists of the time would have considered it impossible to fully conquer. You could potentially take the mainland portion, but the island fortress seemed impregnable. Into this context, Ezekiel makes his prophecy in chapter 26. The prophet doesn't just predict that Tyre will fall. He provides a detailed sequence of events that includes multiple stages of destruction carried out by different forces. First, he says that many nations will come against Tyre, breaking down its walls and towers. Then, he specifically names Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, as one who would attack the city with horses, chariots, and a great army. The prophecy states that he would kill the inhabitants, destroy the walls, and break down the towers. But here's where it gets interesting. The prophecy then shifts to describing how the stones, timber, and rubble of Tyre would be thrown into the sea, and the site would be scraped bare like the top of a rock, becoming a place for fishermen to spread their nets. Finally, the prophecy states that the city would never be rebuilt. When Ezekiel made this prophecy around 586 BC, Tyre was thriving. The city had recently celebrated as Babylon conquered Jerusalem, thinking this would mean more trade opportunities for them with fewer competitors. The idea that mighty Tyre would not only fall but be completely obliterated seemed absurd. Yet history began to unfold exactly as predicted. Just 3 years after Ezekiel's prophecy, in 595 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon began a siege of Tyre that would last 13 years. This is historically documented not just in the Bible, but in the writings of ancient historians. 13 years is an extraordinarily long siege, indicating just how difficult Tyre was to conquer. After this grueling 13-year siege, Nebuchadnezzar finally broke through the walls of mainland Tyre around 573 BC. His army killed many inhabitants and destroyed the walls and towers of the city, just as Ezekiel had predicted. But here's where skeptics might have thought the prophecy failed. When Nebuchadnezzar's forces finally entered the city, they found it largely empty of the wealth they expected. The people of mainland Tyre had seen the writing on the wall during the long siege. They had moved most of their wealth, important citizens, and resources to the island fortress offshore. Nebuchadnezzar had successfully fulfilled the first part of Ezekiel's prophecy by destroying mainland Tyre. But the island city remained unconquered and defiant. For over 240 years after Nebuchadnezzar's siege, the island city of Tyre continued to flourish. It remained a powerful economic force in the Mediterranean. Trade flowed through its ports, and its navy controlled sea routes. To any observer in the centuries following Nebuchadnezzar's campaign, the prophecy might have seemed only partially fulfilled. Yes, the mainland city had been destroyed as predicted, but the island fortress stood strong. The complete destruction Ezekiel described, where the very stones and timber would be cast into the sea and the site scraped bare, had not occurred. Critics could have legitimately argued that the prophecy had failed in its more dramatic elements. Then Alexander the Great arrived on the scene. In 332 BC, the Macedonian conqueror was sweeping through the Persian Empire, conquering city after city. Most cities surrendered to Alexander without a fight, recognizing the futility of resistance. Tyre initially offered to be Alexander's ally and provide him with supplies. There was just one condition. Alexander's army could not enter the island city itself. They would deliver supplies to the mainland, but the island fortress would remain sovereign. For most conquerors, this would have been an acceptable compromise. Tyre was offering resources and alliance without requiring a costly siege. But Alexander had a different vision. Alexander wanted to completely secure his supply lines and control all major ports along the Mediterranean coast before pushing deeper into Persian territory. He also couldn't afford to leave a powerful naval base behind him that could potentially threaten his forces or support Persian counterattacks. More personally, Alexander's pride was wounded by Tyre's refusal. He was the conqueror who had never lost a battle, and Tyre's insistence on maintaining independence was an insult he couldn't tolerate. So, Alexander made a decision that seemed completely insane to his military advisors. He would build a causeway from the mainland to the island fortress, essentially creating a land bridge across half a mile of Mediterranean Sea. This is where the prophecy's specific details become almost eerie in their accuracy. Remember, Ezekiel had predicted that the stones, timber, and rubble of Tyre would be cast into the sea. For over 2 centuries, the ruins of mainland Tyre had sat there, gradually being reclaimed by nature. Alexander needed massive amounts of material to build his causeway across the sea. Where would he get it? He ordered his army to demolish what remained of the old mainland city and use every stone, every piece of timber, every bit of rubble to construct the causeway. His soldiers literally scraped the site down to bare rock, gathering every usable piece of material and throwing it into the sea to build the bridge to the island. Contemporary accounts describe the monumental effort this required. Thousands of workers labored for months, dismantling the ruins of ancient Tyre and casting them into the Mediterranean. They didn't just take some stones. They scraped the entire site clean, fulfilling Ezekiel's prophecy with shocking precision. The prophet had written that the site would be made like the top of a rock, and that's exactly what Alexander's army did. They left nothing standing, nothing remaining of the old city. Every stone went into the sea. The construction of Alexander's causeway was an engineering marvel that would have seemed impossible to ancient minds. His engineers and soldiers worked relentlessly, driving wooden pilings into the seabed and then dumping the rubble from mainland Tyre between them to create a solid pathway. The Tyrians watched from their fortified walls in disbelief as this land bridge slowly extended toward their island. They had never seen anything like this attempted before. Naval powers didn't build bridges across the sea to attack island fortresses. It defied conventional military thinking. The Tyrians didn't sit idle during this construction. They launched raids from their ships, firing arrows and hurling projectiles at the workers. They sent fire ships toward the growing causeway, trying to burn the wooden supports and destroy the construction. At one point, they successfully burned much of Alexander's progress, destroying siege towers he had built on the causeway. But Alexander was undeterred. He simply ordered his men to start again, this time building the causeway even wider and stronger. He brought in more timber, more stones, more rubble from the mainland ruins. Nothing would be left of old Tyre by the time he was finished. As the causeway neared completion, Alexander also assembled a naval force by calling in ships from other cities he had conquered. Tyre's greatest advantage had always been its control of the sea. But now Alexander was challenging them, even in this domain. When the causeway finally reached the island, Alexander's forces attacked from both the land bridge and the sea simultaneously. The siege engines rolled across the causeway that was built from the very stones of ancient Tyre, battering the walls that had stood impregnable for centuries. After a 7-month siege, the walls were breached in July of 32 BC. What followed was one of the most brutal conquests in Alexander's campaign. Enraged by the length of the siege and the Tyrian resistance, Alexander showed no mercy. Historical accounts report that 8,000 Tyrian fighters were killed in the battle. 2,000 more were crucified along the beach as a warning to other cities that might consider resisting. 30,000 inhabitants were sold into slavery. The great city of Tyre, which had stood proud and powerful for centuries, was utterly devastated. But the fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy didn't end with the conquest. It was what happened afterward that completed the picture. Alexander's causeway, built from the rubble of mainland Tyre, became permanent. Over time, sand and sediment accumulated around it, and what was once an island fortress became a peninsula, permanently connected to the mainland. The site of ancient mainland Tyre, scraped bare to build the causeway, remained desolate. In the centuries following Alexander's conquest, there were attempts to rebuild Tyre on the island portion, and a city did exist there for many years. However, It never regained its former glory or power. The economic dominance was gone. The naval supremacy was lost. The city that had once been the jewel of the Mediterranean became a minor settlement. Through subsequent centuries, Tyre changed hands many times. The Romans controlled it, then the Byzantines, then various Islamic caliphates, and eventually the Crusaders. Each successive ruler left their mark, building and rebuilding on the island portion. But here's what's crucial: the site of the original mainland city, the area that was scraped bare by Alexander's forces, was never rebuilt. Even today, over 2 millennia later, the ancient mainland site remains largely undeveloped. Fishermen use the rocks along the shore to dry their nets, exactly as Ezekiel prophesied. Archaeological excavations have occurred there, but no major city has ever been reconstructed on that precise location. Modern scholars and archaeologists have extensively studied Tyre and its history. The archaeological evidence confirms the historical accounts. You can visit Tyre today in modern Lebanon and see Alexander's causeway, now expanded into a permanent land connection. You can see the ruins of various periods of occupation on what was the island fortress. And you can see the largely barren area where mainland Tyre once stood, with fishermen still spreading their nets on the rocks by the shore. The specificity of the prophecy's fulfillment is remarkable when you examine it piece by piece. Let's break down the specific elements Ezekiel predicted and how they were fulfilled. First, he said many nations would come against Tyre. This was fulfilled through Babylon, then Macedon, then Rome, and various other conquering powers throughout history. Second, he specifically named Nebuchadnezzar as one who would attack with armies and destroy the mainland city's walls and towers. Historical records confirm this happened during the 13-year siege from 585 to 573 BC. Third, the prophecy stated that the stones, timber, and rubble would be thrown into the midst of the sea. This happened when Alexander used the ruins to build his causeway in 332 BC, over 250 years after the prophecy was made. Fourth, Ezekiel said the site would be scraped bare like the top of a rock. Alexander's forces literally did this, leaving nothing of the old city standing as they gathered every piece of material for the causeway. Fifth, the prophecy stated it would become a place for spreading nets. The ancient mainland site has indeed been used by fishermen for this purpose throughout subsequent history and continues to be used this way today. Sixth, Ezekiel declared that the city would never be rebuilt to its former state. While settlements have existed on the island portion, the original mainland city has never been reconstructed, and Tyre has never regained its position as a major power or economic hub. Now, skeptics might argue that these predictions were either written after the fact or were so vague that they could apply to many cities. Let's address these objections directly. First, the dating of Ezekiel's prophecy is well established through both biblical scholarship and external historical evidence. The text was written during the Babylonian exile, which is historically documented to have occurred in the 6th century BC. We have manuscript evidence and historical references that confirm this dating. The prophecy was made before Alexander was even born, let alone before he built his causeway. Second, the specificity of the predictions makes them far from vague. Predicting that a powerful island fortress would not only fall, but that the ruins of the mainland city would be literally thrown into the sea to accomplish, this is not a generic prediction. Think about how unusual this detail is. In typical ancient warfare, conquerors used the stones from defeated cities to build their own structures or fortifications on land. They didn't throw perfectly good building materials into the ocean. The fact that this specific, unusual event occurred as part of the conquest of Tyre is remarkable. It wasn't a common military tactic. It was a unique solution to a unique problem that Alexander faced. Third, the multi-stage nature of the prophecy, with different nations playing different roles at different times, adds another layer of complexity. Ezekiel wasn't just predicting a single conquest. He was describing a sequence of events involving Babylon first, then other forces later, with specific details about what each would accomplish. Nebuchadnezzar would destroy the mainland city, but wouldn't achieve complete victory. Then, centuries later, another conqueror would use the ruins in a specific way to reach the island fortress. This isn't the kind of prediction you can easily attribute to lucky guessing or vague language. Some skeptics have argued that prophecies like this became self-fulfilling. They suggest that Alexander, who was educated in Greek culture and would have been familiar with various texts and prophecies, might have known about Ezekiel's prediction and deliberately fulfilled it. This argument has several problems. First, there's no historical evidence that Alexander was motivated by Ezekiel's prophecy or even aware of it. The historical accounts of the siege describe Alexander's decision-making in purely military and strategic terms. He built the causeway because it was the only practical way to reach the island fortress, not because he was trying to fulfill an ancient Jewish prophecy. Second, even if Alexander had wanted to fulfill the prophecy deliberately, he couldn't have controlled all the elements. He couldn't have made Nebuchadnezzar attack Tyre over 250 years earlier. He couldn't have ensured that the mainland city would lie in ruins for centuries, providing exactly the material needed for his causeway. He couldn't have predetermined that Tyre would refuse his terms and force him to undertake this massive engineering project. And he certainly couldn't have controlled what would happen to the site over the subsequent 2 millennia, ensuring that the mainland area would never be rebuilt while the island portion would be connected permanently to shore. Third, the argument that someone deliberately fulfilled the prophecy doesn't explain away the prophecy's accuracy. It actually reinforces it. If historical figures went out of their way to make prophecies come true, that suggests the prophecies had significant influence and were taken seriously. But more importantly, the Tyre prophecy wasn't fulfilled by someone trying to make it happen. It was fulfilled through the natural course of military campaigns, engineering decisions, and historical developments that spanned over 2,000 years. The mathematical improbability of this prophecy's fulfillment is worth examining in detail. Probability experts and mathematicians have attempted to calculate the odds of all these specific elements occurring by chance. Consider the individual components. Predicting that a seemingly impregnable island fortress would fall is one thing, but predicting the exact method by which it would be conquered over 250 years in advance is entirely different. The odds of correctly predicting that the ruins of a mainland city would be used to build a causeway to reach an offshore island are astronomically small. This wasn't a common military tactic. In fact, Alexander's causeway at Tyre was one of the most unique engineering projects in ancient military history. When you calculate the probability of multiple specific predictions all coming true in sequence, you multiply the individual probabilities together. Let's consider just a few elements. The probability that the city would face attack by Babylon, then later by another power. That the first attack would destroy the mainland, but leave the island intact, that centuries would pass with the ruins undisturbed, that a future conqueror would need to build a causeway to reach the island, that he would use the specific ruins of the old city to build it, that he would scrape the site completely bare in the process, and that the original mainland site would remain unbuilt for over 2 millennia. Each of these has a low individual probability, and together they create odds so infinitesimal that attributing this to chance becomes mathematically unreasonable. Dr. Peter Stoner, a mathematician and astronomer who specialized in probability theory, conducted an analysis of biblical prophecies using conservative estimates. For the Tyre prophecy alone, considering just 7 of the specific predictions made by Ezekiel, he calculated the odds of all of them being fulfilled by chance at 1 in 75 million. And this was using very conservative estimates that gave maximum benefit of doubt to natural occurrence. Other analysts using different methodologies have calculated even more extreme odds. When you factor in all the details, including the permanent nature of Alexander's causeway, the continuous use of the site by fishermen, and the specific desolation of the mainland area, the probabilities become even more staggering. What makes these calculations particularly compelling is that they're not based on vague or interpretable predictions. We're not talking about prophecies that could mean multiple things or be twisted to fit events. We're dealing with concrete, verifiable historical facts that either happened or didn't happen. Either the ruins were thrown into the sea, or they weren't. Either the site was scraped bare, or it wasn't. Either the mainland city was rebuilt, or it wasn't. These are binary outcomes that can be historically verified, and in every case, the historical record confirms that what Ezekiel predicted is exactly what occurred. The archaeological evidence further supports the historical accounts. Excavations at Tyre have revealed the layers of occupation and destruction. Archaeologists can identify the Babylonian destruction layer from Nebuchadnezzar's siege. They can trace the construction of Alexander's causeway through geological and archaeological analysis. The sediment layers show how the causeway gradually became a permanent land bridge. The ancient harbor works, once serving an island city, are now landlocked due to the causeway's presence. Every archaeological finding aligns with both the historical accounts and Ezekiel's prophecy. One particularly interesting aspect is how the prophecy distinguished between what would happen to the city itself versus the site. Ezekiel didn't say that no one would ever live in the area of Tyre again. He said the city would not be rebuilt to what it was, and specifically that the mainland site would become a place for spreading nets. This distinction is crucial because settlements have existed in the Tyre area throughout history, including today. Modern Tyre is a city of tens of thousands of people, but it's built on and around the former island portion, which is now a peninsula. The ancient mainland site, the original location of Tyre before the island fortress became the main city, remains largely as Ezekiel described it. This precision in the prophecy is important because it shows that we're not dealing with a prediction that Tyre will be destroyed, which could be interpreted many ways. We're dealing with specific geographical and functional predictions about different parts of the city that have been fulfilled with remarkable accuracy. The island portion has had various settlements and is now connected to the mainland. The original mainland site remains undeveloped and is still used by fishermen. This level of detailed fulfillment argues against vague prediction or lucky guessing. Historical records from multiple independent sources document these events. The Jewish historian Josephus writing in the 1st century AD, recorded details about both Nebuchadnezzar's siege and Alexander's conquest. Greek and Roman historians, including Arrian, Quintus Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus Siculus, provided accounts of Alexander's campaign against Tyre, describing the construction of the causeway in detail. These weren't religious texts trying to prove a prophecy true. They were historical chronicles written by people who had no particular investment in validating Ezekiel's predictions. Yet their accounts align perfectly with what the prophet had written centuries earlier. The siege of Tyre was so significant in ancient history that it appears in multiple historical sources precisely because it was so unusual and difficult. Alexander faced many cities during his campaigns, but Tyre required special effort and unique tactics. The 7-month siege, the innovative causeway construction, and the brutal aftermath were all considered noteworthy enough to record in detail. This independent historical documentation provides strong evidence that we're not dealing with legends or embellished stories. These events actually happened as described, and they happened in a way that fulfilled Ezekiel's specific predictions. Consider also what didn't happen, which is equally important in evaluating prophecy. Ezekiel didn't predict that Tyre would be completely erased from existence, with no one ever living there again. If he had made that prediction, it would have been false, because people do live in the Tyre area today. Instead, he made nuanced predictions about different parts of the city and different stages of its destruction. The mainland would be scraped bare and become a place for nets. The stones and timber would go into the sea. The city would not be rebuilt to its former glory. These are testable predictions that could have been proven false at any point in history, yet they remain accurate even today. The permanence of the causeway is another detail worth examining. When Alexander built this structure, he likely intended it as a temporary military construction, a means to an end for conquering the island. Engineering projects of that era, especially those built hastily during military campaigns, were not typically designed for permanence. Yet this causeway not only survived, but became a permanent geographical feature. Over centuries, sand and sediment accumulated around it through natural processes. The Mediterranean currents deposited material along both sides of the causeway, gradually widening it. What began as a narrow military bridge became a broad isthmus connecting the island to the mainland. This transformation from island to peninsula was not something Alexander could have predicted or controlled. It resulted from natural processes acting on the structure he had built. Yet this permanent connection fulfilled another aspect of Ezekiel's prophecy. The prophet had spoken of the city being attacked by many nations, which would have been much easier to accomplish once the island became permanently connected to the mainland. Throughout subsequent history, various armies marched across this land bridge to attack Tyre. The geographical change made the city permanently more vulnerable, ensuring that it could never again retreat to an impregnable island fortress. The economic decline of Tyre is another element that fulfilled the prophecy in ways that couldn't have been controlled by any individual or army. Ezekiel predicted that the city would lose its preeminent position and never be rebuilt to what it was. Tyre's economic power was based on several factors: its strategic location, its control of trade routes, its powerful navy, and its reputation as an unconquerable fortress. Alexander's conquest shattered the reputation of invincibility. The permanent causeway altered the strategic geography. But the economic decline that followed occurred through market forces and geopolitical shifts that no single person controlled. After Alexander's conquest, Other cities began to rise in prominence, while Tyre faded from its position of dominance. Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander himself, became the new hub of Mediterranean trade. Its superior harbor and strategic location at the mouth of the Nile made it the natural successor to Tyre's commercial empire. Later, cities like Antioch, Constantinople, and eventually Venice would take turns as major trading centers. Tyre never regained its monopoly on Phoenician trade routes. The colonies it had established, including Carthage, eventually became independent powers that owed no allegiance to the mother city. The economic networks that had made Tyre wealthy were permanently disrupted. This economic decline wasn't the result of anyone trying to fulfill a prophecy. It was the natural consequence of military defeat, changing trade patterns, and the rise of competitor cities. Yet it fulfilled Ezekiel's prediction that Tyre would not be rebuilt to its former state. Throughout the Roman period, Byzantine era, Islamic conquests, Crusader kingdoms, and Ottoman rule, Tyre existed as a city, but never as the economic powerhouse it had once been. No ruler who controlled Tyre managed to restore it to its former glory, despite the fact that its geographical location remained strategically valuable. Something intangible had been lost that could never be recovered. The specificity of Ezekiel's language is worth examining more closely. In the Hebrew text, the prophet uses very precise terminology. When he speaks of the stones and timber being laid in the midst of the water, he uses words that indicate complete submersion, not just placement at the water's edge. When he describes the site being scraped bare, he uses a term that suggests scraping down to bedrock, leaving nothing. When he says it will become a place for spreading nets, he uses language that indicates an ongoing, continuous activity, not a one-time event. Each of these linguistic details matters because they narrow the range of what would constitute fulfillment. Modern translations sometimes lose these nuances, but scholars who work with the original Hebrew text confirm that Ezekiel's predictions were remarkably specific. He wasn't using poetic language that could be interpreted symbolically. He was describing concrete physical events and states. The rubble would go into the water. The rock would be scraped bare. Nets would be spread. These are observable, verifiable conditions that either exist or don't exist. And when we examine the historical and current reality of Tyre, we find that these conditions have been met with striking precision. The timing element of the prophecy adds another layer of complexity. Ezekiel made his prediction around 586 BC during the Babylonian exile. Within a few years, Nebuchadnezzar began his siege of Tyre, fulfilling the first part of the prophecy. But the complete fulfillment required waiting over 250 years for Alexander to arrive. This extended time frame actually makes the prophecy more impressive, not less. If everything had happened immediately, one might argue that Ezekiel was simply making educated guesses about current political situations. But predicting events that would unfold over centuries, involving empires and conquerors that didn't even exist yet, requires something beyond political analysis or military expertise. Alexander the Great wouldn't be born for another 230 years after Ezekiel's prophecy. The Macedonian kingdom that Alexander would lead to world conquest was, at the time of Ezekiel's writing, a relatively minor power on the periphery of the Greek world. There was no way Ezekiel could have predicted through natural means that this particular kingdom would produce a military genius who would conquer the known world. that this conqueror would face resistance from Tyre specifically, and that he would employ the unprecedented tactic of building a causeway using the ruins of the mainland city. These weren't foreseeable developments based on the political situation of the 6th century BC. The multi-stage nature of the prophecy is also significant from a theological and philosophical perspective. Ezekiel presented a vision of judgment that would unfold in phases, with different actors playing different roles at different times. Babylon would strike first, destroying the mainland city. Then, after a long interval, another power would complete the destruction using methods that wouldn't even make sense until the specific military situation arose. This sequential fulfillment demonstrates either extraordinary prescience or, as believers would argue, genuine prophetic insight that transcends normal human knowledge. Some scholars have attempted to find natural explanations for Ezekiel's accuracy. One theory suggests that the prophet was making educated guesses based on geopolitical trends. Babylon was indeed a rising power that threatened cities throughout the region, so predicting a Babylonian attack might not seem unusual. However, this explanation fails to account for the specific details about how the city would ultimately be destroyed centuries later. Ezekiel wasn't just predicting a Babylonian conquest. He was describing a complex sequence of events involving multiple powers using specific methods that wouldn't be employed for over 2 centuries. Another attempted explanation suggests that the prophecy was edited or added to after Alexander's conquest to make it appear more accurate. This theory faces several problems. First, the textual evidence doesn't support late editing of this particular passage. The language and style are consistent with the rest of Ezekiel, and there's no manuscript evidence of later editions. Second, the prophecy appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures completed around 250 BC, which is before or contemporary with Alexander's conquests, depending on when exactly the book of Ezekiel was translated. Third, this explanation doesn't account for why ancient editors would choose to fabricate such specific details about throwing stones into the sea and scraping the site bare, details that weren't typical prophetic language and that could easily have been proven false. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, have provided additional evidence for the early dating of biblical texts. While complete manuscripts of Ezekiel weren't found at Qumran, fragments and references confirm that the book existed in substantially its current form by at least the 2nd century BC, and likely much earlier. This archaeological evidence supports the traditional dating and argues against theories of late editing or post facto prophecy writing. The text that describes Tyre's destruction was written before that destruction was complete, not after. What makes the Tyre prophecy particularly compelling to many people is that it's not an isolated case. Ezekiel made numerous other specific predictions that were also fulfilled, creating a pattern of accuracy that's difficult to attribute to chance. He predicted the destruction of other cities like Sidon and the eventual restoration of Israel as a nation. He made predictions about Egypt's decline as a world power while maintaining existence as a nation. Each of these represents a specific, testable prediction that could have been proven false, but instead came true. The pattern of accuracy across multiple independent predictions strengthens the case that something more than lucky guessing was at work. The prophecy's impact extends beyond its historical fulfillment. For believers, it serves as evidence of divine inspiration and knowledge. If a prophet could accurately predict such specific events centuries in advance, it suggests access to information beyond normal human capability. This has implications for how one views other biblical prophecies and claims. For skeptics, the Tyre prophecy presents a challenging case that requires explanation. Even those who don't accept supernatural explanations must account for how such specific predictions came to be fulfilled so accurately. The evidential value of fulfilled prophecy has been debated by philosophers and theologians for centuries. David Hume, the famous skeptical philosopher, argued that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the falsehood of that testimony would be more miraculous than the miracle itself. Applied to prophecy, this means we should look for natural explanations, unless those explanations require more credulity than accepting supernatural foresight. In the case of Tyre, the natural explanations, lucky guessing, vague prediction, late editing, self-fulfilling prophecy, all face significant evidential problems. Each requires accepting coincidences or circumstances that seem less probable than the straightforward reading that Ezekiel genuinely predicted future events. The philosophical implications of accurate prophecy extend into questions about time, causality, and determinism. If future events can be known in advance with specificity, what does this say about free will and human agency? Alexander chose to build the causeway based on his military situation and personal determination. He wasn't forced by fate or prophecy to take this action. Yet the prophecy accurately predicted that this is what would happen. This creates interesting questions about the relationship between divine foreknowledge and human freedom that have occupied theologians and philosophers for millennia. From a purely historical perspective, the Tyre prophecy provides an interesting case study in how ancient predictions can be verified or falsified through archaeology and historical records. Unlike many ancient prophecies that are vague or symbolic, Ezekiel's prediction about Tyre makes concrete claims that can be checked against the archaeological and historical record. This makes it a valuable test case for evaluating prophetic claims more broadly. The methodology used to assess this prophecy, examining original texts, consulting multiple historical sources, considering archaeological evidence, calculating probabilities, can be applied to other prophetic claims as well. The cultural and religious context of Ezekiel's prophecy adds depth to understanding its significance. Ezekiel was writing during one of the darkest periods in Jewish history. The Babylonian exile had torn the nation from their homeland, destroyed their temple, and shattered their sense of identity and divine protection. In this context, prophecies about God's judgment on other nations served multiple purposes. They provided hope that Israel's enemies would also face consequences. They demonstrated that despite Israel's current suffering, God remains sovereign over all nations, not just Israel. And they established credentials for the prophet's message by making specific, verifiable predictions. The fact that Ezekiel chose to make such detailed predictions about Tyre is itself significant. He could have made vague pronouncements of doom that would be hard to verify or falsify. Instead, he provided a detailed roadmap of destruction that would unfold over centuries, with multiple stages and specific outcomes. This was a risky prophetic strategy. If his predictions failed, it would undermine not just this particular prophecy, but his entire prophetic ministry and message. The Jewish people would have known about these prophecies and would have watched to see if they came true. false prophecy was a serious offense in ancient Israel, punishable by death according to Mosaic law. A prophet's credibility depended on their accuracy. The preservation of this prophecy through centuries is itself remarkable. The Jewish people maintained these writings through exile, return, persecution, and dispersion across the known world. The text was copied and recopied by scribes who treated it as sacred scripture. This careful preservation means we can trace the prophecy's text back through history and verify that it existed before its fulfillment. The manuscript tradition, while not perfect, is robust enough to confirm that the essential content of Ezekiel's Tyre prophecy has remained consistent across centuries and copies. Modern visitors to Tyre can see the evidence of the prophecy's fulfillment firsthand. The ancient mainland site remains largely undeveloped, with fishing activity still occurring along the rocky shores. Alexander's causeway, now expanded into a broad isthmus, permanently connects what was once an island to the mainland. Archaeological sites show the layers of destruction and occupation. The contrast between ancient Tyre's glory and its current state as a modest Lebanese city is stark. While modern Tyre has historical significance and archaeological value, it bears no resemblance to the economic powerhouse that once dominated Mediterranean trade. The fishing nets spread on the rocks present a particularly poignant visual fulfillment of prophecy. This wasn't a metaphorical prediction that could be interpreted various ways. Ezekiel said, "Nets would be spread, and nets are spread." It's a simple, direct, observable fulfillment that has continued for over 2 millennia. No one orchestrated this ongoing activity to fulfill prophecy. Fishermen use the location because it's practically convenient for their work. Yet this mundane economic activity fulfills words spoken by a prophet 2,600 years ago. The contrast between prophecies about Tyre and prophecies about other cities is instructive. Ezekiel also prophesied against cities like Sidon, but with different details and outcomes. Sidon was predicted to face violence and disease, but not complete destruction like Tyre. History confirms that Sidon suffered repeatedly through various conquests, but survived as a city and exists today. Jerusalem was predicted to be destroyed, but eventually restored, which also occurred. Each city received specific predictions tailored to its future, and each set of predictions was fulfilled differently. This pattern of varied but accurate predictions argues against generic doomsaying or vague prophecies that could apply to any city. The economic analysis of Tyre's decline reveals factors that Ezekiel couldn't have predicted through normal means. The rise of alternative trade routes, the shift in commercial power to other cities, and the changing nature of Mediterranean trade all contributed to Tyre's permanent eclipse. These weren't just military or political developments. They were complex economic shifts involving multiple regions, commodities, and market forces. Yet the net effect was exactly what Ezekiel predicted. Tyre would never be rebuilt to what it was. The city's economic foundations were permanently undermined in ways that went beyond simple military defeat. Some of the most compelling aspects of the prophecy involve negative predictions, things that wouldn't happen. Tyre wouldn't be rebuilt to its former glory. The mainland site wouldn't become a thriving city again. These negative predictions are harder to fulfill by chance than positive ones. It's one thing to predict that something will happen. Wars, destructions, and conquests occur throughout history. It's another thing to predict that something won't happen over a span of millennia. The fact that the mainland site has remained undeveloped for over 2,000 years, despite its valuable coastal location, is statistically unusual and fulfills Ezekiel's prediction in a way that couldn't be easily manipulated or controlled. The prophecy also demonstrates knowledge of military tactics that wouldn't be employed for centuries. The concept of building a causeway to reach an island fortress wasn't a common ancient military strategy. In Ezekiel's time, naval warfare and siege tactics were well established, but the idea of creating a land bridge across half a mile of sea would have seemed fantastical. This wasn't a predictable military development. It was an innovative, almost desperate solution to a specific problem that Alexander faced. Yet, Ezekiel's prophecy anticipated exactly this unusual tactic by predicting that the stones and rubble would be cast into the sea. The geological and geographical changes that resulted from Alexander's causeway have been studied by modern scientists. Geologists can trace how sediment accumulated around the causeway over centuries, gradually transforming it from a narrow military bridge into a substantial land connection. Oceanographers have studied how the causeway altered water currents and sediment deposition patterns along that section of the Lebanese coast. These scientific studies confirm that the transformation from island to peninsula was a gradual process resulting from the interaction between the artificial causeway and natural forces. Ezekiel's prophecy anticipated not just the military event, but its long-term geographical consequences. The prophecy's fulfillment also involved elements of human psychology and decision-making that couldn't be controlled. Why did the Tyrians refuse Alexander's initial offer of alliance? Why did Alexander decide that conquering the island was worth the enormous effort rather than simply bypassing it? Why did subsequent rulers never successfully restore Tyre to its former economic dominance? Each of these involved individual human choices made by people exercising free will. Yet collectively, these choices resulted in the exact scenario Ezekiel had described. This intersection of free human choice and prophetic fulfillment raises profound questions about providence, sovereignty, and the nature of causality. Historical records show that there were opportunities for Tyre to be rebuilt to its former glory. During the Roman period, the empire invested in cities throughout the region, building infrastructure, harbors, and trade facilities. Tyre's location remained strategically valuable. Yet despite these opportunities, the city never regained its preeminent position. This wasn't for lack of trying or investment. Something intangible about Tyre's economic and political power had been permanently broken. The fulfillment of prophecy sometimes involves not just dramatic events, but also subtle, long-term trends that prevent restoration or recovery. The manuscript evidence for Ezekiel's prophecy deserves closer examination. Ancient manuscripts of biblical texts show remarkable consistency in the Tyre prophecy across different manuscript traditions. The Masoretic text, preserved by Jewish scribes, contains the prophecy in substantially the same form as it appears in ancient Greek translations and in fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This textual stability across different languages and transmission traditions confirms that we're reading essentially the same text that ancient readers would have known. There's no evidence of significant editing or modification to make the prophecy better fit historical events. The witness of early historians who wrote between the time of the prophecy and its complete fulfillment provides an independent verification timeline. Historians writing during the Persian period, between Nebuchadnezzar's siege and Alexander's conquest, made references to Tyre that confirmed the city's continued existence as an island fortress after the Babylonian attack. These intermediate sources are valuable because they show the prophecy was only partially fulfilled during this interim period. The mainland city had indeed been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, but the island remained powerful. These historians had no reason to fabricate information to support a Hebrew prophet's predictions. They were simply recording the political and military situation of their time. When Alexander's historians later recorded the siege of Tyre, they did so with extensive detail because it was one of the most challenging and innovative military operations of his entire campaign. Arrian's account, written several centuries after Alexander, but based on contemporary sources, described how the causeway was built using material from the old city. Plutarch's biography of Alexander mentions the siege and its difficulty. Quintus Curtius, Rufus provides dramatic details about the combat and the causeway's construction. Diodorus Siculus offers yet another account. The fact that multiple, independent historical sources describe the same events in compatible ways strengthens the historical reliability of these accounts. These ancient historians weren't writing to prove Ezekiel right. Most of them probably had never read Ezekiel's prophecy or had any interest in Jewish scripture. They were recording what they considered the significant military achievements of Alexander the Great. Yet their accounts align perfectly with what a Hebrew prophet had written centuries earlier. This independent corroboration is powerful evidence that the events occurred as described, and that Ezekiel's prophecy was genuinely predictive rather than retroactive. The archaeological work at Tyre has involved multiple expeditions over decades, conducted by researchers from different countries and institutions. French archaeologists conducted extensive excavations in the 20th century. Lebanese teams have continued this work. International collaborations have studied different periods of the site's occupation. The consensus from these various independent research projects confirms the historical sequence: Babylonian destruction of the mainland city, followed by centuries of the island fortress's prominence. Then Alexander's conquest using a causeway built from mainland ruins, followed by various periods of reduced occupation. No archaeological evidence contradicts this sequence or suggests an alternative narrative. One fascinating archaeological detail is the discovery of Phoenician harbor installations that are now landlocked due to Alexander's causeway and subsequent sediment accumulation. These ancient harbor works were built to service an island city with careful engineering to handle Mediterranean currents and tides. Their presence confirms that Tyre was indeed an island when they were constructed. Their current landlocked status confirms the permanent geographical transformation that resulted from the causeway. These physical remains tell a story that matches both the historical accounts and Ezekiel's prophecy. The economic data from ancient sources also supports the prophecy's fulfillment. Trade records, shipping manifests, and commercial documents from the Hellenistic and Roman periods show the shift in economic power away from Tyre toward other cities. Alexandria became the dominant port for Egyptian grain exports. Antioch controlled trade routes into Asia. Rhodes developed as a commercial hub. Tyre appears in these records, but as one of many ports, not as the preeminent trading center it had once been. This economic marginalization fulfilled Ezekiel's prediction about the city's permanent decline. The religious and theological implications of the Tyre prophecy have been debated extensively. For Jewish and Christian believers, it serves as evidence of divine inspiration of Scripture. If God could reveal future events to Ezekiel with such precision, it validates the prophet's other messages and, by extension, the reliability of biblical revelation. For skeptics, it presents a challenge that requires finding naturalistic explanations that can account for all the specific details. A debate often centers on whether the evidence is sufficient to justify belief in supernatural prophecy, or whether some combination of natural factors can explain the apparent fulfillment. From a philosophical standpoint, the Tyre prophecy raises questions about the nature of evidence and belief. What level of specificity in a prediction would constitute proof of supernatural foreknowledge? How many details would need to be correct? How improbable do the odds need to be before we should abandon natural explanations? These are not easy questions, and different people will draw different conclusions based on their prior assumptions about whether supernatural prophecy is possible. However, the Tyre case provides a concrete example for testing these questions, rather than dealing only with abstract possibilities. The literary structure of Ezekiel's prophecy also reveals careful composition. The prophet presents the prediction in a structured format with clear stages and specific actors. First, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Then, a more general reference to many nations. Then, specific details about what would happen to the physical city, the stones, timber, and rubble cast into the sea, the site scraped bare. Finally, the long-term outcome of nets being spread and the city not being rebuilt. This structured presentation makes the prophecy easier to remember and transmit, but also easier to verify or falsify. Each element can be checked independently against historical and archaeological evidence. The comparison with failed prophecies is instructive. Throughout history, many people have claimed to predict the future with specificity. The vast majority of such predictions have failed. Cities predicted to fall have survived. Empires predicted to endure have collapsed. The historical record is littered with failed predictions, which makes the accurate ones more remarkable by comparison. Ezekiel's prophecy about Tyre stands out precisely because it was so specific and yet was fulfilled so completely. If the prophecy had failed in any major respect, if the mainland city had been rebuilt, if Alexander had conquered Tyre without using a causeway, if the site had not been scraped bare, it would have joined the ranks of failed predictions. The survival of Ezekiel's prophecy through periods when its fulfillment seemed unlikely is also significant. During the centuries between Nebuchadnezzar's attack and Alexander's conquest, someone observing the situation might have concluded that the prophecy had failed. The island city of Tyre remained powerful and prosperous. There was no indication that anyone would cast the mainland ruins into the sea or scrape the site bare. Yet the prophecy was preserved through this period, maintained in Jewish scripture despite apparent non-fulfillment. This preservation meant that when Alexander did arrive and use the exact method Ezekiel had described, the prophecy was available for verification. If the text had been edited or created after Alexander's conquest, we would expect signs of that in the manuscript tradition, but we find none. The interdisciplinary nature of studying this prophecy is worth noting. A comprehensive evaluation requires expertise in multiple fields, biblical studies, and ancient languages to understand the original text, ancient history to verify the sequence of events, archaeology to examine physical evidence, probability and statistics to assess the likelihood of chance fulfillment, geology to understand the geographical changes, and philosophy to evaluate the epistemological questions about prophecy and evidence. The fact that experts in each of these fields can examine the prophecy from their respective perspectives and find it compelling adds weight to the overall case. Modern technology has enabled new types of verification. Satellite imagery shows the current geography of Tyre, including the broad isthmus connecting the former island to the mainland. Underwater archaeology has explored the ancient harbour works and the foundations of Alexander's causeway beneath the sea. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have mapped the extent of ancient occupation without requiring destructive excavation. Radiocarbon dating and other scientific methods have confirmed the chronology of different occupation layers. All of these modern scientific tools have been applied to Tyre, and all confirm the historical narrative that fulfills Ezekiel's prophecy. The comparison with contemporary prophecies about other cities provides context. Ancient Near Eastern literature contains many predictions about cities and nations. Some were vague enough that they could be interpreted to fit many outcomes. Others were specific but failed to be fulfilled. Ezekiel's prophecy about Tyre stands out for combining specificity with accurate fulfillment. This isn't just because we're selectively focusing on one successful prediction while ignoring failures. Ezekiel made multiple other specific predictions that also came true, creating a pattern of prophetic accuracy rather than one lucky guess. The enduring nature of the prophecy's fulfillment is perhaps its most remarkable feature. This isn't a prediction that was fulfilled once and then became irrelevant. Elements of Ezekiel's prophecy remain verifiable today, over 2,600 years after he spoke them. You can visit Tyre right now and observe that the mainland site remains largely undeveloped. You can watch fishermen spreading their nets on the rocks. You can walk across the isthmus that was once Alexander's causeway. You can see that while a city exists in the area, it bears no resemblance to the economic powerhouse that once controlled Mediterranean trade. The prophecy isn't just historically verified, it's currently observable. This ongoing fulfillment distinguishes the Tyre prophecy from many other historical predictions. Most prophecies, even if initially accurate, become matters of historical debate over time. Details get lost, evidence becomes scarce, and verification becomes difficult. But with Tyre, anyone with the resources to travel to Lebanon can see the evidence with their own eyes. The archaeological sites are there. The geography is unchanged. The fishing activity continues. This accessibility to verification makes the prophecy particularly powerful as evidence. It's not asking people to trust ancient manuscripts alone or to accept historical claims they cannot verify. The proof is visible on the ground today. The psychological impact of visiting Tyre and seeing the prophecy's fulfillment has been documented by numerous travelers, scholars, and pilgrims over centuries. Even skeptics who visit the site often express surprise at how precisely the current state of Tyre matches Ezekiel's ancient prediction. The visual experience of standing on the rocks where fishermen spread their nets, looking at the barren mainland site, and seeing the land bridge to what was once an island, creates a powerful connection between ancient prophecy and present reality. This experiential dimension adds a layer to the evidence that goes beyond intellectual analysis. The prophecy has also had significant cultural and religious influence throughout history. For Jewish communities in exile and persecution, it served as a reminder that God's word would be fulfilled even when circumstances seemed impossible. For early Christians, it validated the prophetic tradition that they believed pointed to Christ. For Islamic scholars, who also recognize Hebrew prophets, it demonstrated divine knowledge transcending human understanding. This cross-cultural impact shows how the prophecy has functioned in multiple religious traditions as evidence of supernatural revelation. Modern apologetics. The defense of religious faith through rational arguments frequently cites the Tyre prophecy as one of the strongest evidential cases for biblical inspiration. Christian apologists from different theological traditions, whether conservative or progressive, often point to this prophecy because it doesn't require accepting miraculous events like resurrections or divine interventions in nature. It simply requires accepting that Ezekiel accurately predicted future historical events in unusual detail. This makes it particularly useful in dialogues with skeptics who might be willing to consider historical evidence even if they reject miracle claims. The prophecy has also influenced how people think about divine sovereignty and human history. If God could orchestrate events involving multiple empires over centuries to fulfill specific predictions, it suggests a level of control over history that many find either comforting or challenging. For believers, it reinforces faith that God is actively involved in human affairs and that divine purposes will ultimately be accomplished. For skeptics, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether the universe operates according to purely natural laws, or whether there might be purposeful direction behind historical events. The scholarly debates about the Tyre prophecy have produced sophisticated arguments on both sides. Skeptical scholars have proposed various naturalistic explanations: that the prophecy was edited after the fact, that it was based on logical political analysis, that the fulfillment is exaggerated or coincidental. Believing scholars have countered with manuscript evidence, probability calculations, and detailed historical analysis showing the prophecy's accuracy. These academic debates demonstrate that the Tyre prophecy is taken seriously even in secular scholarship as a phenomenon requiring explanation, not something that can be easily dismissed. The educational value of studying this prophecy extends beyond religious instruction. It provides an excellent case study in critical thinking, historical methodology, probability assessment, and evidential reasoning. Students learning to evaluate historical claims can examine the Tyre prophecy as a test case, applying various analytical tools and considering what standards of evidence should be required. Whether one ultimately concludes the prophecy, demonstrates supernatural foreknowledge, or remarkable coincidence, the process of rigorous analysis is valuable in developing critical thinking skills. The preservation of skepticism alongside belief is important in evaluating the prophecy fairly. Not everyone who studies the Tyre prophecy concludes it proves divine inspiration. Some maintain that natural explanations, while perhaps unlikely, are still more probable than accepting supernatural prophecy. This diversity of interpretation is healthy because it prevents the evidence from being dismissed as convincing only to the already converted. The fact that the prophecy generates serious scholarly debate rather than universal acceptance or rejection suggests it occupies interesting evidential middle ground, strong enough to demand explanation, but not so overwhelming that it eliminates all doubt. The integration of the Tyre prophecy with other biblical predictions creates a cumulative case that many find more compelling than any single prophecy alone. Ezekiel also predicted the destruction and scattering of Israel followed by eventual restoration and return to the land. This occurred with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the establishment of modern Israel in 1948. Isaiah predicted Cyrus by name as the one who would decree the rebuilding of Jerusalem over a century before Cyrus was born. Daniel predicted a sequence of empires that many scholars see fulfilled in Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. When multiple specific prophecies from multiple prophets are all fulfilled accurately, the cumulative probability becomes even more remarkable than any individual case. The relationship between prophecy and faith is complex. Some people come to faith primarily through prophetic evidence, finding the fulfilled predictions compelling proof of divine revelation. Others already have faith and view fulfilled prophecy as confirmation rather than foundation. Still others examine the evidence and remain unconvinced, finding naturalistic explanations more satisfying despite their limitations. The Tyre prophecy doesn't force belief, but it does provide substantial material for those seeking to evaluate religious claims based on historical evidence rather than pure faith alone. The future orientation of some aspects of Ezekiel's prophecy remains relevant. The prediction that Tyre would never be rebuilt to its former state is ongoing. Every year that passes without Tyre regaining its ancient prominence is another year of prophetic fulfillment. Every generation of fishermen spreading nets on those rocks continues the pattern Ezekiel described. This open-ended nature of the prophecy means it remains subject to potential falsification. If tomorrow some historical shift caused Tyre to become a dominant economic power again, the prophecy would be proven false. The fact that this hasn't happened in over 2 millennia, despite the location's continued strategic value, is itself evidence supporting the prophecy's supernatural origin. The prophecy of Tyre stands as one of the most remarkable examples of specific, verifiable prediction in ancient literature. Ezekiel's detailed description of how this mighty Phoenician city would be destroyed through multiple stages by different conquerors using unusual methods, resulting in permanent decline, was fulfilled with extraordinary precision over the course of centuries. The Babylonian siege under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the mainland city. Alexander the Great's innovative causeway, built from the ruins of that mainland city cast into the sea, conquered the island fortress. The site was scraped bare in the process. The geographical transformation from island to peninsula became permanent. Fishermen spread their nets on the desolate rocks, and Tyre never regained its former economic dominance. What makes this prophecy compelling isn't just that it was fulfilled, but how it was fulfilled. The specific details, stones and timber thrown into the sea, the site scraped to bare rock, the transformation into a place for spreading nets, the permanent decline, were not generic predictions that could apply to many cities. They were precise descriptions of events and outcomes that had been verified through multiple independent historical sources, archaeological evidence, and observable current reality. The mathematical improbability of all these elements occurring by chance, combined with the manuscript evidence confirming the prophecy was written before its fulfillment, creates a powerful evidential case. For those seeking to understand whether prophecy can provide evidence for divine revelation, Tyre offers a concrete test case. It demonstrates that some biblical prophecies were not vague, symbolic, or written after the fact. They made specific, falsifiable claims about real cities and real events. The Tyre prophecy could have been proven wrong at numerous points. If Nebuchadnezzar had conquered the island, if Alexander had used different tactics, if the causeway hadn't become permanent, if the mainland site had been rebuilt, if Tyre had regained its economic power. Yet at every decision point, history unfolded in the exact way Ezekiel had predicted. Whether one concludes this demonstrates supernatural foreknowledge or represents an extraordinary coincidence ultimately depends on one's broader framework for understanding reality. But the evidence itself is clear. Ezekiel made specific predictions about Tyre's destruction that were fulfilled with remarkable accuracy over the course of 2,600 years. The ruins, still visible today, the fishermen still spreading their nets, and the modest city that bears Tyre's name but not its former glory, all testify to words spoken by a prophet in exile millennia ago. In a world where most ancient predictions have been forgotten or proven false, the prophecy of Tyre remains fulfilled, verifiable, and profoundly thought-provoking.